In our last three lectures, we took a look at the way humans have viewed God over time. We looked at the ways in which human apprehension of God has changed over time. This time we'd like to illustrate that entire progression by looking at the gods and goddesses of a single culture, that of Hindu India. Indian mythology is stunningly rich, and it's also stunningly problematic, and they turn out to be two sides of the same coin. Hindu India has had pretty much a continuous cultural history since about 1500 BCE, and despite various occupations and conquests, it's held on to its core beliefs and values so that Hindus today are worshiping in traditions that are many thousands of years old. On the other hand, there have been a lot of adjustments over those years, prompted both by external and by internal stimuli. So it turns out there isn't anything like a final or orthodox version of anything. Hinduism is an amazing conglomeration of chance association and loose confederation and syncretism. It makes Hinduism anything but a unified religion or mythology. There are many versions of everything, and they all seem to tolerate one another within a loose framework. It's also complicated by the fact that both Buddhism and Jainism are Indian religions which grew out of Hinduism and then in turn influenced the mother religion. Both have their own body of myths which sometimes overlap and sometimes conflict with Hindu mythology. So what we'll be getting here is a kind of simplified version, a kind of primer of Hindu Indian mythology. And I'll give you a couple of references along the way so that you can do some more work on this on your own if you'd like. The sources for Indian theology and mythology are likewise abundant and distributed widely over time. The oldest texts are the Vedas, and they were compilations of hymns to and about deities. The oldest one is the Rig Veda, which is a collection of over 1,000 hymns. The Vedas were not really written down till about 800 to 600 BCE, after the Aryans learned how to write. But the texts were so sacred that priests had been memorizing them word for word and passing them along for centuries. So the material is, of course, much older than that 600 to 800 to 600 time we have for the writing of these. Later on, then, a huge mass of secondary material grew up around those Vedas. The Brahmanas are a collection of priestly books which contain a lot of mythology, and they're also full of theological treatises. The Puranas are antiquarian books which are full of mythological lore. The Sutras are books on ritual which contain some myths themselves. And then the Upanishads are philosophical speculation which also contain a lot of mythological allusions. The secondary materials are helpful in many ways in explaining the Vedas, but by the time they were written, Hindus had moved some distance in the direction of classical Hinduism, so that by that time many of the myths were being retold or reinterpreted to match new insights and circumstances. And then in the classical period, we get the two great epic poems of India, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, both of which are about incarnations of Vishnu, but in the process they tell a lot of other myths. Beneath the lowest layer of Aryan mythology is the mythology of those peoples who lived in the Indus Valley in cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro before the coming of the Aryans. They were defeated and displaced by the Aryans in about 1500 BCE, and then they tended to move southward, where they're still known collectively as the Dravidians, and to this day they preserve some of the old culture and language. They didn't have writing, so we have only archaeological evidence, which, as we looked at back in Lecture 13, is really tricky to interpret without any context at all. It is possible that some later Hindu gods and goddesses came from this very early stratum of life in the Indus Valley. Seals that have been found at Harappa show gods with bull's horns, sitting cross-legged, and mother goddesses with plants growing from their wombs. Sometimes they're surrounded by animals, bulls, rams, deer, elephants, tigers, rhinoceroses, buffaloes, and sometimes serpents. Perhaps Shiva and his consorts may reach all the way back to this early agricultural religion, since many of these motifs show up later in their myths and cults. Southern India still has many towns worshiping goddesses that may be descendants of those figures, some of whom seem to be in art supervising human sacrifices, and there may have been some of that way, way back in history in the Indus Valley as well. By the time of the Vedas, the most important god in Hindu pantheon was Indra. He gets about 250 out of the hymns in the Rig Veda. We've already mentioned Indra in Lecture 18. The Aryans, when they moved in, were lighter skinned than the indigenous people, and they were also hard-drinking, horseback-riding warriors, and Indra turned out to be a lot like them. Soon after they settled in, the Aryans created their four-caste system. The top caste is the Brahmins or priestly class, and the second class are the warriors or rulers. The third class are the merchants and craftsmen, and the fourth are the untouchables. Probably originally they were the darker-skinned indigenous people who got pushed out. The upper three classes each had its own pantheon. The upper class gods were those of the Brahmin class, but the Brahmins were usually willing to ally themselves with the second class, the rulers and warriors, and so their gods got along pretty well, at least initially. By the time we get to the Vedas, Indra, who was a warrior god, was the king of the gods. He didn't quite start that way. Behind him, we have a succession of creator gods who, as we've seen in earlier lectures, tend, once they've managed creation, to retreat to the sky and to turn over their authority to others. In Indian myths, behind Indra, there's a certain Daios as a creator, and we remember that Sanskrit is an Indo-European language, so Daios is clearly related to the Latin word for God, Deus, or even to the name of the king of the gods in Greece, Zeus. There's also a certain Varuna, who's a god who maintains cosmic order, but by the time of the Vedas, both of those gods have been pretty much pensioned off, and the day-to-day running of things is handed over to younger gods, especially to Indra. How Indra gets to be the king of the gods is an interesting story in itself, and it should sound somewhat familiar to us. His father tries to kill him. Indra winds up killing his father and taking his father's thunderbolt. And in a story that sounds very much like the story of Uranus, Kronos, and Zeus in Greece. And then Indra wins his position, stabilizes his position by killing a dragon figure who has locked up all the water of the world, all of the clouds of the world, causing a huge drought on the earth. This story sounds so much like Marduk killing Tiamat that we've had in the Babylonian story that it's been suggested that there may be some direct connection of one of these stories on the other. There are, however, some uniquely Aryan details in this story. Indra fortifies himself for his great battle with his dragon by drinking enormous amounts of soma. Soma is a hallucinogenic drug which was used in Vedic sacrifice rituals. Sometimes it was also understood to be the elixir of the gods, like the nectar on Mount Olympus. He drinks so much of it that he swells to the size of 2 worlds. And then after his defeat of Vritra and Vritra's mother, like Marduk, he becomes the creator god, dividing the earth and the heaven, the land and the sea, and organizing things and creating time. He makes, in fact, it's a beautiful detail in the story, I think, is that he makes sunrise a special moment of creation, so that each sunrise every day for people is an axis mundi. It's a moment where we come back in contact with those original powers of creation. Once he was established on the throne, Indra spent much of his career fighting demons. There are lots of stories about battles with demons. Like Zeus, Indra was also a weather god who uses the thunderbolt as a weapon. And therefore, because he has the thunderbolt, he's also a god of rain, which makes him, like many other gods of his type, makes him a fertility god as well as a warrior. He also provided a kind of basis and sanction and justification for kingship among the Aryan ruling class. It's a great combination of virtues, but it didn't prevent him eventually from being put out to pasture. It's a complicated story, but what happened was, as the Brahmins gained greater control over religion, sacrifice and ritual became as important for maintaining the cosmos as fighting for it. Macho warriors like Indra got slowly pushed aside to make more room for gods of the Brahmin class in a way that didn't quite happen to Zeus and Marduk under similar circumstances. In a later version, in fact, of Indra's fight with Vritra, he wins not because he overwhelms him in hand-to-hand combat, but because gods and humans were offering sacrifices for him, and the sacrifices are what defeats the dragon, not Indra. In a story in one of the Puranas, we get to actually see Indra getting set aside. Vishnu tells his followers not to bother to worship Indra anymore, since he's done for, he's passé, he's finished. Indra tries to retaliate and gets humiliated by the younger god, suggesting that his time has really passed. The whole story about this, the gradual replacement of warrior class gods by Brahmin class gods is a very interesting one. It's far more complicated than we have time for here, but let me suggest a couple of places that you might go look if you're interested in details. It is a good story. W. Norman Brown has an essay called Mythology of India, and Veronica Ions has a book called Indian Mythology, and one I particularly recommend, Jean Pouvel, has a book called Comparative Mythology, which does a very nice job of showing how the gods of the warrior class give way to the gods of the Brahmin class. What I want to do is, using those three books as our segue, I want to jump ahead to the point in developed classical Hinduism when the three most important gods are Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu. Brahma came to be the creator god. He absorbed a lot of characteristics of creator gods before him, and there are many, many versions of how he creates the universe. In one, the Lord of the universe broods over an egg floating on cosmic waters for 1,000 years until a lotus springs from his navel. From the lotus springs Brahma, who then goes about creation. After a series of trials and errors, he eventually creates other immortal beings. In another story, he creates 4 sages to complete creation, but they get so absorbed in worshiping Vishnu that they lose track of what they're doing, and Brahma gets angry, and from his anger springs Rudra, the storm spirit who lives on the Himalayas, who later contributes something to the portrait of Shiva. In the laws of Manu, which we looked at back in lecture 10, Manu is the sage who survives the ending of one cosmos and the beginning of the next. And in that story, we remember Brahma appears as a great fish who warns him of the impending flood and then saves him from that flood. We also looked at a myth, a dismembered god myth of Purusha, out of whom the universe was created, and Purusha too came to be associated with Brahma. There are many, many stories of how Brahma is involved in the creation. Over time, as theologians and philosophers tended to think of creation in abstract rather than mythological terms, however, Brahma was downgraded and lost his pristine status. He's still the figure whose 100-year lifespan determines the lifespan of the cosmos, and whose 100-year sleep is the time till the next creation. But in classical Hinduism, he's clearly subordinate to the 2 principal gods, Shiva and Vishnu. Modern Hinduism, in fact, it's been said, is pretty much divided into those who worship Shiva and those who worship Vishnu, each one of whom has absorbed vast amounts of materials from the gods who preceded them. Both also have wives or consorts who have also absorbed a great deal from earlier goddesses. The names of both Shiva and Vishnu appear in the Rig Veda, but there's not much assurance that they have anything in common with the figures as they developed later. Shiva is the more difficult for Westerners to understand, at least for me, he's the more difficult to understand, since he has such a paradoxical combination of attributes. He may actually be descended, as we said, from pre-Aryan agricultural gods, and he's also descended from Rudra, who's a Vedic god of storms, whose home is in the Himalayas. And so he winds up with some very interesting characteristics. Where in the Hindu pantheon, Brahma is the creator and Vishnu is the preserver, Shiva is the destroyer. But he's not just the destroyer, he's also the lord of the dance, and he's portrayed in sculpture with his 4 arms and 1 leg raised in a kind of cosmic dance of ecstatic creation. One of his symbols is the lingam, or the phallus, and one of his wife Parvati's symbols is the yoni, the female genitalia. So they're also generative principles, not just destructive ones. But he is still the one who produces the fires of dissolution that ends each cycle of the universe. He and Parvati, his consort, are kind of the eternal hippies of the pantheon. They camp out in desolate places like caves or the tops of mountains, or they even spend lots of time in cremation grounds with their loads of half-consumed human corpses haunted by jackals, witches, and demons. And in desolate places like these, Shiva meditates, his hair unkempt and knotted, his body smeared with ashes, practicing austerities and yoga that give him such fantastic power. Meditation and yoga of this sort came to be associated eventually with narcotic drugs, which were justified in the myths of Shiva and Parvati. She would prepare them for him, and many ascetics dedicated to Shiva's service used such drugs to achieve the final vision. Paradoxically, and everything is paradoxical in Hindu mythology, only those who are prepared by long years of discipline and austerities are ready for such drugs. So it isn't a matter of ordinary people finding a good, strong, hallucinogenic drug and then using it to find God. Shiva's meditations are extraordinary by any standard, and there's one myth about him that shows that. The gods learn that there is a demon that is so powerful that he will destroy everything, including the gods. None of the gods will be able to stand up against this demon. The gods also learn that the only hope they have is that if Shiva can be talked into having a son, that son can defeat the demon. The problem is twofold. One is that Shiva is mourning for his wife Sati, who had earlier immolated herself because her father had insulted Shiva. And secondly, Shiva is in the high Himalayas practicing meditation and austerities. But it also turns out that at the same time, a woman named Parvati, who we find out is a reincarnation of Sati, that is Shiva's first wife, is herself in the Himalayas practicing austerities in the hope of re-winning Shiva as her husband. The gods send down Kama, the god of desire. He's a little like Eros in Greek mythology or like Cupid in Latin mythology. Send down Kama with his feathered or his flowered arrow to shoot an arrow at Shiva. And if he can do it at some moment when he just catches a glimpse of Parvati, we'll see what happens. What happens is that he does glance up from his meditation, sees her, catches a glimpse. Kama launches his arrow at exactly the right moment, and everything happens according to plan. They fall in love, they are married, a boy is born, the universe is saved. Parvati herself is a composite goddess made up of qualities of many earlier goddesses, some of them perhaps older than the Aryan invasions, as is true of Shiva as well. She's a demon slayer herself, and in art she's often portrayed riding on a lion. She has many arms and she carries an arsenal of weapons in those arms. This side of her character is violent and demands blood sacrifice, and in this aspect she can be ruthless and violent. But like Shiva, she is also a disciplined ascetic. She wins her husband, we remember, by practicing austerities for 1,000 years, and the two together are the Lord and Lady of procreation, as we can tell from their symbols of the lingam and yoni. In one of her manifestations, she's called Devi, the goddess, and she's thus the feminine principle in Indian mythology called a Shakti. It's a feminine noun that means power. Every Indian god has his Shakti, without which he's powerless to act. Without a feminine side, he's mere potential, so that in important ways, the feminine is at least as important as the masculine in Indian mythology. Without his feminine side, a god has no effective power. Like Shiva, Parvati has her darker side, which is usually expressed as different manifestations of the goddess. Parvati as Durga is a warrior against demons, and she emerges from Parvati when Parvati becomes angry. We've run across this idea before. When Brahma gets angry, he manifests Rudra, who is his anger. It's an interesting idea. I'm Grant now, lecturing on world mythology, but in Indian mythology, if I got so angry that I started behaving like an entirely different person, I should be given a different name, a name for the manifestation, my manifestation, which is my anger. And this happens very frequently in Indian myths. Parvati, angry, becomes Durga, or even Kali, the Dark One. Kali is the goddess whose job is to destroy demons, but sometimes she can get so drunk with power and blood that she becomes capable of destroying the world. In one particularly interesting story, she has been slaying demons, and she gets carried away with her power, with the ecstasy of victory, that she begins to dance, and she dances in such ecstasy that the earth eventually begins to rock. The gods get worried that the earth is in danger of being destroyed here. Shiva intercedes by lying down in front of her, so that as she continues to dance, she will have to dance on him. She doesn't even see him lying down there first, and she begins to dance on his body until she realizes in a kind of horror what it is that she's doing, and then she stops her dance and the world is saved once again. In Hindu mythology, Kali is a manifestation of Parvati, and may look back to a time when the goddess, as maiden, as mother, as crone, was responsible for birth and fertility and death. As we've seen back in Lecture 11, the last age of the cosmic cycle, the Kali age, is named after her. So she's as complicated as her consort, Shiva. Both of them may have origins in the agricultural people who lived in Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro before the coming of the Aryans, but they are really complex figures. The most myth-friendly of the three great Hindu gods is Vishnu, the preserver. He's briefly mentioned in the Rig Veda, but by the time we get to classical Hinduism, there's little connection with the earlier god. Like Brahma and Shiva, he's absorbed a lot of qualities from other gods who preceded him, making him a great bundle of virtues and myths. All over India, there are shrines to gods who are thought of as manifestations of Vishnu. As the preserver, each time the balance of good and evil in the universe tips in the wrong direction, he incarnates himself, and he's known in mythology primarily through those incarnations, or as they're sometimes called, avatars. According to Indian myth, he's had 10 major incarnations and countless minor ones. The two most important of the incarnations were as Rama and as Krishna, and they are memorialized in the two great Indian epic poems, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. I want to tell you just about one of his incarnations. This one is the one that's recorded in the Vishnu Purana, which comes from about the 6th century, and the Bhagavata Purana, which comes from maybe the 10th or 11th century. In the myth, Vishnu incarnates himself as Krishna to defeat a certain king Kamsa or Kansa who threatens the stability of the earth itself. That's why Vishnu incarnates himself, is just for moments like this. He decides to be born of an upright couple, Devaka or Devaki, and her husband. King Kamsa is warned that Vishnu tends to be incarnated as one of the children of that couple, so he takes the couple, locks them in prison, and then kills each child as it's born. When Krishna is born, however, he puts the guards all to sleep and then has his father carry him as an infant to the country where he's exchanged for an infant girl who was just born to some cowherds. The cowherds are named Nanda and Yasoda. They become very important in Indian mythology. King Kamsa tries to kill and then of course his father brings the little girl back and says, we had this girl. King Kamsa tries to kill the young girl anyway. He's looking for a boy, but he decides to kill the girl anyway. But she reveals herself as the goddess Devi and says it's too late. Vishnu has already been born anyway, and then she disappears back to heaven. Krishna, meanwhile, gets raised by cowherds, and they have no idea that they're raising an incarnation of Vishnu. They think that he's their biological son. King Kamsa, like Herod in the New Testament, orders the killing of all male children under a certain age, but he fails to kill Krishna, and so the story goes on. Even in his infancy, Krishna kills demons, he performs all manner of miraculous actions. He convinces the local cowherds to stop worshiping Indra, and when Indra retaliates by sending a great storm, the boy Krishna holds a mountain over the cowherds' heads like an umbrella until Indra gives up. As we mentioned earlier, this is one of those ways in which we can see Indra getting set aside. The myth itself is rich in battles and marriages and the building of new cities, and of course it culminates in the defeat of King Kamsa and the return of Krishna to heaven. That's why he incarnated himself in the first place. But the parts of the story that have engaged the most attention over the years are the youthful pranks played by Krishna. And then, really, really important, his relationship with the gopis, with the cowgirls, when he becomes a handsome and brilliant young man. In a famous episode, he comes upon a group of gopis bathing in a river, and he steals all their clothes. And then he takes their clothes and climbs up a tree. When they come out of the water, they realize their clothes are missing, and so they look for their clothes, and then he calls to them from the top of the tree where he has their clothes, and he makes them one by one come up to the tree, raising their arms as they come before they can have their clothing back. Nobody ever holds these things against Krishna because he is such a wonderful, lovable young boy, and all of the women are absolutely in love with him. In exchange for their clothing, he promises that he will dance with them. And some of the most beautiful moments in this story happen when he goes out at night into the middle of the forest and plays his flute. And all of the women hear that flute music and are drawn out to dance with him. And because of his marvelous power, each one of them thinks that she is the lucky one who is the only one getting to dance with Krishna himself. His favorite of all of the gopis, however, is Radha, and their story becomes one of the great love stories of India. It's full of yearning and passion and separation and consummation. Later, Indian poets turned it into one of the great bodies of erotic poetry in the world, and painters still continue to illustrate that story to this day. Since Krishna is really Vishnu, a religious turn was also given to that story so that Radha's yearning for Krishna becomes an allegory of the soul's yearning for union with God. So this great body of painting and poetry is at the same time is a fantastic erotic story and a deeply religious one. Again, if you want to pursue this further, there are two books that I really highly recommend that tell this story in beautiful detail. One of them is by W.G. Archer. It's called The Loves of Krishna in Indian Painting and Poetry. And the other one is Archer's edition of the poems of Vidyapati. Vidyapati was one of the classical poets who made the most of this beautiful love story. And both books are richly illustrated with Indian paintings. They make great reads. The last stage of the Indian biography of God corresponds to the last lecture, in which we called the last section the God Within. In India, theologians and philosophers came to believe that even Brahma and Shiva and Vishnu are mere manifestations of Brahman, an impersonal force that lies outside of any culture or history, but is the power behind everything, including the gods that we usually picture in more anthropomorphic ways. Leeming and Page, whom we've quoted earlier before, say this about this particular development in Indian mythology. Brahman is ineffable and unknowable beyond our comprehension, and yet Brahman is our reason for being. In terms of our biographical approach to God, Brahman is the most accurate picture we can hope to paint of the essence of God, as opposed to particularized cultural expressions of God. As such, Brahman can be said to be the power behind God's many cultural masks, whether Zeus, Osiris, Goddess, or the great Abrahamic God himself. If you'd like to pursue these ideas further, and this is really an interesting development of religious thought, if you'd like to pursue these ideas further, the best place to do so is to find a good translation of the Upanishads, the oldest of which date back to about 800 to 400 BCE. And here that idea that Brahman is the essence of everything and everything else is simply a manifestation in some way of Brahman is really put forward in very clear ways. In one of the translations, the translator named Juan Mascaro says this about this moment in the development of Indian thought. Brahman is the universe. God in his transcendence and immanence is also the spirit of man, the self, in everyone and in all, Atman. Thus, the momentous statement is made in the Upanishads that God must not be sought as something far away, separate from us, but rather as the very inmost of us, as the higher self in us, above the limitations of our little self. In rising to the best in us, we rise to the self in us, to Brahman, to God himself. That is where we ended our last lecture, and that is where we will end this one, our brief look at Hindu gods and goddesses. This also concludes our entire unit on gods and goddesses. I hope it's been suggestive of some further reading and some thought on your part. Next time we'll start a new unit on myths about heroes. We'll start with a definition of the hero according to mythographers and also define the genre of heroic myth. And then we'll take off into some of the best and most exciting stories in the world. The first one that we'll look at is Gilgamesh, the early Sumerian poem. That we all start next time.